Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce today Maria Thomas, my colleague in Vienna. She is trained in art history and theology at the universities of York, in Oxford, and in Salzburg, and at VU Amsterdam. She is interested in textual material and visual cultures of pre-modern Syriac Christian communities. Her research focused broadly on the materiality of text and writing across media and all their social value and also liturgical. Her PhD thesis, which is completing these days at VU Amsterdam, examines textual memorials produced at two Syriac monasteries, the Monastery of Mary Magdalene in Jerusalem and the Monastery of Moses in Neb, between the 11th and the 13th centuries, analyzing how this text constructed and articulated collective identity and memory. And she also serves as the Middle Eastern Studies editor for the Digital Orientalist. And within our project in Vienna, she is organizing this year an online seminar on the followers of the apostles in cultic contexts. And with this, Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers, Dan, Marion, Georgia, and Andy, for the opportunity to present my work here. And thank you to all of you in the audience for taking the time out to be here this morning. I think I'll get to my paper right away, Dan, if I could. Yeah. Am I good to go?
You may wish to put it in slide mode.
Is that better?
Not just yet. Yes, it is. Perfect. Thank you.
Yes. Perfect. So I'll get into my presentation right away. So here what you see is folio 249 recto of a 13th century Syriac manuscript, modern Church of the 14 Martyrs, MS41, Syriac Orthodox Gospel Lectionary, according to the Harklian tradition, images of which are now available through Himmel. It is a full-page miniature, as you see, depicting 7 figures with an interlaced border. The figures, as you see, are organized in 2 registers. The top register depicts Christ enthroned, flanked by an angel on each side. The lower register comprises of 4 figures and various levels of completion. The ones standing furthest apart, with the halos, are more complete than the 2 figures rather awkwardly arranged between them. This arrangement, or more cramping of the 2 figures in the middle, and the stylistic and the state of completion, as mentioned. For example, you can see that there's still line drawings and not fully colored in, as well as the stylistic difference. For example, how the hands are rendered suggests that these 2 were added at later stages, together or separately. So the 2 images in the middle were added later. So what you see here are 2 or 3 layers of painting, at the center of which is obviously Christ. And also, if you look closely, books. You see here Christ holding a book in his hand. So does the figure, the kneeling or the seated figure in the middle, in the lower register, as well as the figure to the left, dressed in a monk's mantle. He's also holding a book. So all in all, this is likely a dedication scene showing figures connected with the making or patronage of the book, presenting it to Christ. A familiar comparison is the mosaic in the southwestern entrance of Hagia Sophia, which many of you would know, where you can see Emperor Constantine and Emperor Justinian holding models of Constantinople and Hagia Sophia and offering them to the Virgin who sits with Christ child on her lap. A potential clue, coming back to our image, a potential clue to the identity of the individuals, especially of the two original individuals in the lower register, um, may be found in the manuscript's colophon. On folio 161 verse of the manuscript appears a beautifully written colophon nestled among the lections of Sunday of the Resurrection, which begin on folio 160 recto. The colophon is relatively standard in form and addressed to Christ. It records the scribe's activity here, the copying of the account of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. B, petitions for mercy and forgiveness on behalf of the scribe. C, includes an act of presentation in which the scribe likens his work to the two small copper coins offered by the widow in the temple, as recounted in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. And D finally concludes with a request that Christ admit him into his kingdom. These tropes recur in numerous colophons, as you know, and as well as inscriptions across the Syriac Neophyte Commonwealth. What is perhaps most interesting, particularly if you were to look for the identities of the people depicted in the miniature, is a text found in red, placed horizontally on either side of the colophon. It gives the name Theodorus Dioscorus. Given the context of this name, it is most likely that it is the name of the scribe, and by further conjecture, one of the figures depicted in the miniature. Most likely, one of in the first round of paint, depicted in the first round of painting. Whether it is the figure on the left in a monastic mantle, or the figure on the right depicted in a conventional garb of bishops with the white bearing large crosses is still up for debate. Scholars like Lower and more recently Kaplan and Pasha Miran have identified the scribe Theodorus Dioscorus as Dionysius of Hesensia, modern-day Karput in Turkey, who was a bishop of the city in the 13th century. Bar-Hebraeus described in his ecclesiastical chronicle this person as a learned man, an excellent scribe, and a friend of the books. Given that there is no date provided in the colophon or elsewhere in the book, it is difficult to know when the manuscript was completed. That is, before or after Theodorus became a bishop. However, given that he inscribes his name as Theodorus Dioscorus rather than Dionysius of Hesensiad, it is likely that he is the monk in the miniature rather than the bishop. I'd be very curious to know whether anyone out there knows of examples where a scribe continues to use their pre-episcopal name when copying manuscript after they become a bishop. That would be an interesting case, but I think in this case, he's still a monk. And in this miniature, he presents a book. So it's the figure on the left presenting the book. There is no indication of who this bishop is, the other figure on the right, within the manuscript as far as we know. However, their presence in this miniature suggests that they played a significant role in the production of this manuscript. Now, another familiar comparison to this image, particularly in modern context, can be perhaps this image. An image of an author with a producer or an editor or publisher on the occasion of the book's publishing. Unlike modern publishing, however, where the author or originator, plural is possible as well, takes center stage in making a text, the product of individual or collective research, knowledge, experimentation, and creativity, and making it available to others in a lasting form. Pre-modern Syriac book was often divorced in space and time from the authors or originators of the text themselves. For example, Syriac biblical manuscripts copied in the medieval period across Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia were separated from the early Christian authors and late antique translators and editors of these texts for centuries and vast distances. What we more commonly encounter are book producers such as Theodorus Dioscorus and perhaps the bishop, who were not only involved in the copying of the text and when deemed necessary, modifying these texts, but who also determined every aspect of their material form, despite having no contact with the original authors of the book's content. This is not to suggest that all medieval Syriac books were produced or circulated this way, divorced from the original authors, that is. For instance, figures like Dionysius Bar Salibi, who in the 12th century um, seems to have been more involved in the production and dissemination of his work. Even so, while the role attributed to authors differs significantly between modern publishing and pre-modern manuscript production, the underlying motivations are not dissimilar. In both cases, the aim is the durable preservation and communication of ideas through a physical material medium. What distinguishes book production from the mere copying of a text is this concern not only for the transmission of an idea across time and space, but for the inscription of that idea within a specific time and space. It is this process, I think, that lends the book, and by extension its text, an added measure of authority and credibility. With these observations on medieval book production or publishing in mind, I turn to the promised case study, um, the manuscript production at the Syriac Orthodox Monastery of Mary Magdalene and Simon the Pharisee in Jerusalem in the 12th century. So, this monastery was likely founded in the 9th century by a Coptic nobleman named Macarius, um, and was perhaps like Darel Surian occupied by the Copts and the Syriac Orthodox. What we know is that right around the time of the First Crusade, this monastery was abandoned for a short period of time. And then after the First Crusade, the community comes back. And there was um, a period of rebuilding and re-inhabiting of the monastery. So the manuscript production I'm going to talk about is part of this process. Um, this manuscript that you see on your screens, Leo MS1, is a Fangita copied in 1138 at the monastery by a scribe named Michael IV. It is now preserved in the municipal library in Lyon. The manuscript is written in semi-cursive estrangler and consists of 320 folios. It opens with a full-page cross composed of intertwined strands of yellow, orange, and gray, accompanied by writing, as you see. It is followed by a table composed of circles, each containing numbers, a number and a commemoration. The main body of the manuscript consists of offices for the liturgical year, beginning with the dedication of the temple and ending with commemorations of locally venerated saints, including Mary Magdalene. Towards the end of the manuscript is a four-page text, paratext, that contains, among other things, information about the people and circumstances that facilitated, influenced, or simply surrounded the production of this book. Throughout these 4 pages, the scribe identifies himself more than once. Most strikingly, he names himself and asks for prayers in an elaborate labyrinth designed and on folio 319 verse L. The text radiating from the central cross identifies his contribution. Michael inscribed, laid out, drew, and wrote this book. He likens himself to Matthew and Zacchaeus from the Gospels, perhaps suggesting a former secular career, possibly in tax collection, since both figures are described as tax collectors in the Gospels before becoming a monk, that is, Michael. However, elsewhere in this four-page text, Michael describes himself quite differently. He identifies himself as a fisherman who later wore, that is, perhaps becoming a monk. This book was written by a fisherman named Michael, who wears wool and is from the province and district of the city of Marash. He belongs to the famous convent of Mar George, also called Dar Casliut, in the Black Mountains. With this information in hand, Michael's comparison of himself to Matthew and Zacchaeus may be read as a reflection on a sinful or materially oriented life that he left behind to become a monk. Here, as you can see, he also traces his origins to the province of Marash and to the monastery of St. George in the Black Mountains. Another manuscript, Paris Syriac 64, restored at this monastery in 1135, suggests that Michael was already in Jerusalem at this date, since he's identified there as a restorer of this manuscript. Beyond its striking visual design, the labyrinth Michael chose for his supplication allows him to place um, his name in a way that it can be read from all four directions. This is not the only place in which Michael inscribes his name. It also appears intricately woven in ornamental designs elsewhere in the manuscript, such as the example on folio 172 are shown here. Sorry. Um, Clearly, Michael's strategies for being remembered as a scribe of this manuscript were successful. His name appears multiple times throughout the codex, often set apart and emphasized through colorful decoration. Yet, returning to the four-page colophon, we find that Michael devotes considerable attention to the contribution of another figure involved in the manuscript production. He attributes to More Ignatius, Metropolitan of Jerusalem, responsibility for taking care, assigning, arranging, and laying up this book. The Ignatius mentioned here is most likely Ignatius Gardena, who served as the Syriac Orthodox Metropolitan of Jerusalem between 1125 and 1138, a very year in which this manuscript was completed. It was not the only manuscript commissioned and supervised by Ignatius Gardena. Another Paris manuscript, Paris Syriac 54, was copied at the monastery and completed in the year 1138. Also benefited from um, Ignatius Gardena's supervision. Its scribe, Romanus, like Michael, credits Ignatius for his guidance in his colophon on folio 117 verso. He wrote, this gospel lectionary was completed in a monastery of the holy city of Jerusalem in the year 1449 of the Greeks, on the 25th day of the month of Ab, by the least of the monks, the very unworthy priest Romanus, a disciple of our father Ignatius, metropolitan of the said place and the coast. This colophon shows that Metropolitan Ignatius Gardena played an important role in scribal activity at the monastery during his episcopate. It also provides further information about his career. According to Romanus, Ignatius Gardena was raised um, at the patriarchal palace and was initially appointed Metropolitan of Edessa by the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, Athanasius VII. However, he was unable to assume this position due to the conflict between Athanasius and Basil of Edessa. Instead, he was transferred to Ahmed, where he served the church for 5 years before being appointed Metropolitan of Jerusalem in 1125. The scribe Michael credits Ignatius Gardena with reviving the monastery, both spiritually and materially, the monastery of Mary Magdalene, spiritually and materially, after assuming the metropolitanate. Part of this revival involved the production of liturgical manuscripts, as you can see from the two examples for the monastery. Michael's Fenkito and Romanus's Gospel Lectionary were part of a coordinated effort not only to restart the monastic library, but also to revive Syriac Orthodox liturgy in Jerusalem. Ignatius Gardena's death in 1138 did not halt this process. His secretary Romanus, the scribe of Paris Syriac 51, ascended to the episcopal seat in the same year as Ignatius Romanus. Like his predecessor, he was also actively involved in manuscript production at the monastery. During his episcopate, at least 3 additional Syriac manuscripts were copied there, and likely several of those were preserved and even repaired within the monastic collection. The liturgical manuscript copied at the monastery during Ignatius Romanus's tenure include 3 gospel lectionaries according to the Harklian tradition. The first example shown here was copied in 1143 by a scribe named Yeshua. This manuscript was until recently held by an auction house in the States and is now in the hands of a private collector. It contains notes identifying not only the scribe but also Ignatius Romanus, the Metropolitan. um, and his aid in the production of the manuscript. In 1149, the manuscript you see to the right of the screen was copied by a scribe named Sohodo. It is now preserved at the Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate as MS 12:4. This manuscript likewise includes a note identifying the scribe and the metropolitan and explicitly credits Ignatius Romanus with commissioning the volume. A third gospel lectionary, again according to the Herculean tradition, was copied in 1173, a decade before Ignatius Romanus' death in 1183, by a scribe named Esaias. This manuscript is now part of the British Library collection as 7171, and I do not actually have an image of this manuscript. A more depth comparison of these manuscripts will be the subject of perhaps another paper, but I have the images for you here. And what's interesting is that on the left, where you see Abdul Masih's manuscript, which was in a private collection, which is now in a private collection. This manuscript is considerably smaller than Leo MS1 and the other manuscripts, images of which you've seen before. But you can nevertheless see some similarities in the table of contents as well as in the decoration. Especially striking is the ornament. If you look closely, you can see that Abdul Masih, like Michael before him, inscribed his name within the ornament. And the image on the right shows the Damascus manuscript. This is an image of the final page of the main text and the beginning of the long colophon, or historical note towards the end of the manuscript. So I've shown you these manuscripts and the paratextual material in them to, I guess, highlight a few points. The first being that Syriac manuscript production that we gauge from looking at these manuscripts was largely a collaborative endeavor, often organized under the guidance and supervision of the metropolitan or often experienced scribes and teachers. A second thing that these manuscripts reveal is that the frequency of titles, diagrams, colophons, historical notes, and other paratextual elements found in them, is that they were not simply copied but adapted to the needs of the community. What we see here then is not merely the reproduction of a text, but the production of a manuscript or a book. Moreover, this paratextual material suggests that producers of these manuscripts valued not only for their valued these books not only for their textual content, but also as sacred liturgical objects. The repeated prayers for remembrance and the inscriptions of names in multiple locations can hardly fail to recall other forms of writing. Is a reminiscent of other forms of writing, like, for example, this inscription that you see here. And the third thing that I think these manuscripts reveal is that these manuscripts were produced at least 7 centuries after Thomas of Hercules' translation of the New Testament into Syriac, and many more centuries after the historical or attributed authors of these texts. In this context, the agents responsible for the dissemination of this text and its theological commitments are its producers or publishers, who are carefully named and recorded within these manuscripts. Thinking about medieval Syriac manuscript production in terms of publishing allows us to tease out the structures of authority and agency and to develop a more expansive view of the people and context involved in the production and circulation of manuscripts. And secondly, to connect these practices to ones that continue into contemporary Syriac Orthodox monastic centers. And I can think of publishing activities taking place in the Netherlands, in Syriac Orthodox centers in the Netherlands, for example. Recently, the scholar of European manuscripts, Christopher D. Hamill, observed that medieval European monasteries functioned as the earliest publishing houses. Other scholars have come to similar conclusions. Felicity Reedy before him, and more recently, Ben Paul has published about this. And in the Greek circles, we have Patrigandrus, who has identified um, Greek manuscript production centers as publishing houses. But in the Syriac context, monasteries as sites of structured manuscript production have yet to be fully explored. One contributing factor may be the lack of archaeological or visual evidence for a physical space, a scriptorium, where monks sat down copying manuscripts under the supervision of a lead scribe. However, the absence of this familiar feature from European monastic context should not, I think, discourage Syriac scholars from exploring the possibility that Syriac manuscript production was likewise a structured enterprise in which different forms of authority, expertise, and labor were exercised and developed. Michael's colophon in Lyon MS1 evokes the image of a metropolitan carefully selecting texts to be copied, marking sections for transcription, arranging them for his scribe. From Romanus's colophon, we know that Ignatius, perhaps using a term very familiar to us, proofread and approved his work. This level of close engagement by ecclesiastical authorities is also found in contemporary manuscript production outside of the monastery of Mary Magdalene. For example, Paris, Syriac 355, you can see images of the manuscript on your screen. Another 13th century manuscript begins with a miniature cycle, as you see, but before preceding this cycle, we find a full page colophon. And the text of this colophon records that the manuscript was sent from an unknown monastery to Melitene to be illuminated around the turn of the 13th century. It describes the circumstances of this transfer and lists the scenes and other decorative elements executed by the painter Joseph, a deacon in Melitene. Crucially for our purposes, though, it also notes Joseph's work as being supervised by the Bishop of Melitene. I'd like to conclude my paper by thinking about what these ecclesiastically led forms of manuscript publishing did for these texts. I suggest that the oversight exercised by ecclesiastical authorities in these processes and its material attestation in colophons, scribal notes, and other forms of producers' paratext function as forms of licensing. These mechanisms identified books and their contents as correct and acceptable, aligning them with doctrinal, educational, and spiritual goals of the communities that produced and used them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think I speak for all of us when I say that we have not only enjoyed all of the manuscript images that you promised and shared us, but most of all, your talk itself. And so it's my great pleasure to open the floor for questions. Please, if you have a question for Maria, anything you would like to discuss or bring up, feel free to raise your virtual hand so we can give the floor to you. It is also possible to write out questions in the chat and we can even read them out for you if you can't speak. And Maria, if you wouldn't mind, could I perhaps, to start us off, ask you about the example of Ignatius that you shared? I was fascinated by the different roles and activities of the people involved in writing and publishing. And so you described, or you showed that Ignatius was not only the one who commissioned the work, but also the one who corrected it. And you started your talk with an analogy with modern publishing. Perhaps in modern publishing, we would be inclined to think of correcting and proofreading as somehow perhaps lower tasks, tasks below authorship, perhaps somehow slightly mechanical in nature. But in your example, this seemed not at all to be the case. It seemed that the correcting is very much connected with authority. So I was curious if this is what you see and
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful point to bring up. Thank you for that question, especially in today's age when places and people are making AI do much of the editing, proofreading work. So the significance of the task itself. Yeah, so in these contexts, and I guess perhaps even in modern context, it should be an important work. But it definitely, in these contexts, it seemed like a very important task. And but in this specific example, Romanus is just beginning to copy manuscripts. So I think there is an added layer of supervision from his editor, his commissioner, Ignatius Godina. But I definitely, in the examples that, and later when we looked at the later illuminated manuscript, we also have the sense of someone overseeing the process. In the example of Joseph, the illuminator. So it's not only just the copying of the text, but also the decoration of it. We have an ecclesiastical figure who seems to be overseeing it and perhaps suggesting changes and correcting. If you look at manuscripts in that I've seen, I'm pretty sure people in the audience have much better examples. We do see sometimes a second hand coming in, a very similar, and we can't tell the different the separation in time between those corrections. Some can be done much later too, but there are definitely instances of corrections coming right after the copying of the text, suggesting that there is, someone doing the very important work of editing and proofreading.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. And for our second question, I would like to give the floor to Dan.
Thank you very much for this paper. It's very interesting to see. I mean, in other areas, we just have weird manuscripts lost with no provenance or fragments of them. And suddenly, in what you showed us, we have a sustained publishing project, which is really nice to see that it is possible to even trace back and down. But my question is. The ignorant question is, what's that descriptor of a scribe, the wool wearer? What's that's happening? And that's one. And the other one is in the first example that you showed us of a table of contents, there were the first lectionary, there were two items that were erased. What's going on with that as well? I mean, were they wrong? Was it the wrong reference, or did they say something else? If you happen to have thought about that. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, Dan. So the first one, I wanna throw it back into the audience because I feel like what I took it from it, and I want to think based on something I've read out there was wearing wool is becoming a monk, taking on a monastic habit. So likening to taking upon a monastic habit, but please, if you're doing a better reading of that, I'm all ears. So yeah, I hope that's the answer to your first question. And to the second one, so with this manuscript, it's really interesting because the table of contents doesn't seem to be tailor-made for this manuscript. So it has, if you flip through the manuscript, you see that it has more spaces that are actually, more circles than the contents of the manuscript. And you see someone scraping one entry to suggest that, to correct the numbering off of it. So there seems to be a disparity between the table of contents and the content of the book itself. And that kind of, again, that I'm glad you brought it up because that kind of make you pause and think about the process itself. So when did this table of contents come? It's all bound together in, properly. It doesn't feel like a later material addition to it, but it makes you think about the process during the first round of production of this manuscript itself. But there are loads of instances. In most instances, what you see is that it actually fits, or there are one or two circles or spaces left because it would make sense for it to be empty. But in this, there is a big disparity between the table of contents and the content of the manuscript itself.
Thank you very much.
Stephanie, please.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you all. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I could not believe my luck because I've been engaging similar questions to the ones that you were tackling in your paper. And I'm just so pleased that I could listen to this today. So I'm working with scientific compendia in Armenian. Colleagues are working on Syriac. And it seems to me that in the 12th century, there was a big revival of perhaps late antique text. And it seems to me like there is some intelligence to this production of manuscripts. Because in the Middle Ages, they look so similar. You look at catalogs, and these manuscripts seem to really come from the same project. I haven't come across such a structured system, though, that I can really pin down with evidence. And again, scientific compendia is not the same as the other editorial project with theological text. But I wonder how much is transferable. So here I'd like to ask, is there anything I can look out for in particular? Like, is the repetition of sequences of text potentially a good sign? What can I look for? And do you reckon that this model could apply to more of Eastern Christian cultures? So I'd really like to build a bridge here.
Thank you for that question. That is wonderful to think about. And though I want to. So again, I must confess that some of my training was in Western manuscripts, and in Western manuscript, you look for patterns, you look for especially as an art historian, you look for the hand, and um, transferring that to Syriac, though there are obviously within my examples too, there are loads of similarities between the manuscripts and decorative elements, for example, certain use of certain texts or certain commemoration. For example, one of what allowed me to put these manuscripts together in the first place was the commemoration of Mary Magdalene in a lot of these texts. So kind of localize it to Jerusalem then. And then, then finding these examples of, well, mentions of scribes and of metropolitan. So that was one way I went about it. And I was very tempted to look for the similarities in ornamentation and things like that as a way of placing it all together. But I must confess that I've actually seen similar things outside of Jerusalem as well. And I'm not surprised though, because as you think, 12th century, we have loads of movement. We have a lot of these scribes that we have writing in Jerusalem came to Jerusalem after the fall of Edessa. So, or were working in other places. So we have loads of movement, and I don't think I should be surprised to see elements of this manuscript or of book production here in other examples. And that could actually be what's making our projects like ours perhaps a little difficult, because people and ideas are in flux at this moment. Well, so it is little things like the commemoration of Mary Magdalene, but I do want to build upon this project and see perhaps more codicological aspects. I've not been able to see all of these manuscripts for myself, but it would be interesting to see what kind of paper they use, what kind of ink they use, perhaps what are the sources, what sort of binding they use. Perhaps these are all clues to how we can, bring this, uh, put together a library like this. There are other instances where, for example, Dar al-Surian, we have loads of little colophons that say that these manuscripts were brought to there. So obviously, texts are very much a clue, to putting together a collection in a place, but also I want to think that more material clues are definitely out there. And with access to these manuscripts, with studying them as material objects, I think we can do something there as well. To place these objects, to a particular place or a particular a particular movement, in terms of like learning or dissemination of knowledge in general. Thank you for that, and I'd love to hear more about your project.
For the next question, we'll turn to Brett.
Okay, I just have a very small and particular question, but it's something I've been wondering about for a while. This figure with the omophryon, is this common in the Syriac visual tradition? Because I have only seen a couple of instances where episcopal figures from the Syriac artistic context have this omophryon garment, which is associated more classically with the Eastern Chalcedonian tradition. One manuscript that comes to mind is preserved at Mosul, and it's used in a depiction of Cyril of Alexandria. So in the later Syriac tradition, the liturgical vestment develops a little bit differently. And so the shape and typically the design of the garment worn by the bishops doesn't quite look like what you see in the late antique depictions of bishops. The Syriac garment is called the uroro rabo, the great cloth, and it has a head hole. It wears a bit different than the Eastern Chalcedonian garment. So just a question about this liturgical vestment. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett, for that question. So, perhaps a place to look are wall paintings, Syriac wall paintings, or monumental art from this period, where you see this style of garb for bishops. This is, I can definitely talk about one example, which is Derma Musa, where you find these are wall paintings executed in this period, 12th, 13th century, and you find similar garb to this. But yeah, you're absolutely right about, the development, but we don't the separate development of garb in the different traditions. But it's interesting that in visual culture, I I I I wouldn't, from what I've seen, it is quite frequently you can see examples of bishops in omophrons.
But that's interesting. I wonder if they were depicting something from their actual experience, whether this was how bishops continued to dress in some places, or whether it simply becomes a kind of an artistic convention that harks back to late antique Christian art.
That's a very good question. I must admit, um, though obviously there's loads of scholarship saying that it's often like copying a artistic convention because you have artists moving between different traditions, between different churches and denominations, working for different groups, um, but working with one style across different groups. So there is instances for that, examples of that in the 12th, 13th century. So that could potentially be the reason why we see not a lot of diversity in the visual depiction of like bishops from this period. But having said that, the other possibility I have not explored it enough to say this is perhaps the right one. But from my reading of
Yeah.
literature on it, you're right. Yeah, that does exist. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I haven't considered those.
Thank you, Bud. We would have space for a few more questions, so please feel free. I do believe there is a question by Georgia.
Yes. Actually, there are a couple of questions, if that's allowed, but one is
Very
very
good.
small. I was curious about the form of the colophon that you showed with Michael, with his name recurring and this trajectory, sort of labyrinthic. It was the first time for me to see one, so I was wondering whether you have more examples of that. And the second is a bit broader, and I wanted to circle back to the beginning of this Q&A, so the end also of your topic, because you show that there is indeed a sort of editorial project behind some manuscript. We can see somebody supervising, and we also saw some figures recurring in different manuscripts. So I was wondering if you could puzzle things together and see an editorial project broader than a single manuscript. So an idea to build a library in a way, or what kind of books were produced if there is a broader aim. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question about the labyrinth form. So I have not come across contemporary examples in Syriac manuscripts, but they definitely are some later ones. And by later, I mean like modern ones that I've come across. So that, and again, but they are more labyrinths than, but what's more perhaps common is a layout of colophonal paratextual material in the form of cross, say, for example. And this is something from Lewis Reed's presentation here at TeTra. I noticed that this is something that you find in Armenian manuscripts as well, and he's developing a whole project on it. So it would be interesting. So the examples in the Syriac tradition that I've seen are, yes, there are others, but not. I've not seen anything exactly like this. So I'm all again throwing it back to the audience. If you know anything, I'm all ears. As for the second one, thank you for asking that, because that was my project for my doctoral work. So I did put together, so at the Monastery of Mary Magdalene, other than for these gospel lectionaries, we know that there were other manuscripts produced. So by produced, I mean copied as well as rebound and used. So we have a Masura manuscript that I can think of from the top of my head that was used at the monastery, that was rebound and reused at the monastery. Though majority of them are liturgical manuscripts, we do also have um, a collection of works by Dionysius the Areopagite, part of the collection. So we do have, we can make a sense from this paratextual material and examination of that. We can make a sense of a collection and a library in the making. Another clue which is very fascinating, is that Michael the Syrian, the patriarch, visits the monastery in twice actually in the 12th century, and he makes little notes in loads of the manuscripts, saying that this belongs to this monastery, so don't you dare take it away. So again, that is another proof, like an a deliberate attempt to have these manuscripts in one place. So again, the deliberate attempt to perhaps collect these manuscripts. So there are a few, apart from these scribal notes, there are notes like Michael's that give us a sense of these manuscripts being brought together or kept together at the Monastery of Mary Magdalene. And I don't know. I had on my last slide this publication, this chapter that I published recently, where I go into some of those manuscripts, so to get a sense of like what was kind of brought together. But yeah, definitely they're not just liturgical manuscripts; there are other manuscripts too, and colophons and such paratextual material help us, gauge a sense of a collection at the Monastery of Mary Magdalene in this period.
Thank you.
If there are no further questions, I propose that we all
I think Andy has one.
Andy has
Andy has one. Great. Andy, I'm sorry, please.
Andy, we can't hear
We
you.
can't.
Perhaps I can sneak one in and before Andy figures out his
By all means.
his system. So what was could you remind us what was the situation at the beginning with the scribe who's also drawing himself there as a monk when he was by now a bishop? That was the situation there.
Thank you for that question, because this is something I've noticed, and I'm hoping other people have examples of this. Is yes, so we have loads of instances where monks go on to become bishops. In fact, I want to think of it the other way around. Part of I want to use the word grooming, but preparing oneself to become a bishop seems to be scribal work as well. I mean, we have in the 13th century Bar Hebraeus writing about, education in general and all that it takes to become ecclesiastical figures within the Syriac Orthodox context, at least. But he doesn't mention specifically, copying text or scribal acumen as one of the one of the things that priests are trained in, but definitely from priest to bishop there seems to be this scribal work, the ability to choose text, the ability to copy text seems to be an important part of the preparation of one to become bishop. So here the example that I presented, we have Romanus, um, who goes on to become a bishop, but he does a lot of, he does scribal work before, on the way, in preparation for that. He's a secretary of Gardena and then becomes and continues his work by supervising the production of manuscripts, like his predecessor. But I'm again all ears to examples from other contexts of some, of this kind of episcopal training, perhaps.
Thank you very much.
Margaret, please. Margaret, if you are there, feel free to jump into the discussion.
I'm sorry. Am I there now?
Okay. Oh, yes, we can see you and hear you better.
Okay. I'm sorry. I always turn everything off and then I forgot I've turned it off. I'm talking about the Icelandic situation in which it's more likely to find a monk who becomes an abbot than a monk who becomes a bishop, although there are a few. But the assumption is always that when he has become an abbot or whatever higher rank, that all of his writing, and it's usually composition rather than merely copying, that all of that is over with. And he did that while he was still a monk, and he would not have done it mostly because he would have been too busy when he had attained a higher position. And I'm very intrigued. So are your bishops thought to be still copying manuscripts, or, as you said, just sort of overseeing the process?
Thank you for that. Yeah, so in the context of at least the Monastery of Mary Magdalene, it's definitely overseeing. Those are things of arranging. So the word, again, I'm still working with my translation of the Syriac in these contexts because, that there are loads of, so it can be arranging, drawing up, preparing. These are some of the terms used to describe the activities of the bishops in these contexts. They seem to be not copying as much as overseeing. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And this, you discussed this in your book?
Oh, I don't have a book just yet.
I'm sorry.
I wish. No,
I missed the very beginning, and I thought I saw a picture of a book.
That was just a humble little chapter that just came out.
Okay.
But hopefully there'll be a book at some point, and I'll keep you posted on that.
Well, I'm really curious because we have this issue, and it's not just in ecclesiastical writings, but when it says that somebody wrote a book, sometimes we know for sure. Yes, this guy, he wrote and he copied it and so on and so forth. But other times we're saying, well, okay, but this is the king, or this is somebody like that. He didn't do it himself. He presumably was the patron of the book, or had it copied or written or translated or whatever it was. So I would be very happy when your thoughts on those different phrases come out. I have no Syriac, so yeah.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that, though, because that is something that looking at patronage of books, it isn't very clear often, like you said, if what the role of the person mentioned in these manuscripts often are. But Syriac tradition, at least the manuscripts I've looked at, there are loads of people mentioned, and they all seem to have different roles. So it does make a fascinating case study for for authority and division of labor and agency or in these contexts. Thank you very much.
To wrap up, we have indeed a question from Andy in the chat. He is asking about the independence of the monastery of Jerusalem and the level of guidance by the patriarch in Melitene. So he asked about the example you showed where a manuscript was sent to Melitene to be decorated. Some of the bishops of Jerusalem had been monks in Melitene before they were appointed, including one of the Ignatiuses who was in contact with Barsalibi. And he asks if you get any information on this from the colophons.
Thank you so much for this question, Andy, because this reminded me of a point that I missed I think while answering George's question. So one of the texts, a very popular text that was at the monastery of Mary Magdalene this period was Barsalibi's commentary on the Eucharist, which Ignatius Gadina commissioned or requested Barsalibi to compile for this community. So this text was likely in Jerusalem in the period that I'm looking at. So yes, so the connection, so that is a very direct connection, but well, actually, I take it back because it's not he was the Bishop of Ahmed actually when he wrote that text. So it wasn't perhaps coming from Melitene, but Ahmed. But again, you see connections between Jerusalem and other places. Melitene specifically, so the Melitene example, I must say, was just another 13th century manuscript and not related to the monastery of Mary Magdalene. Or because we don't know whether text of the manuscript was copied in, and I don't think it is the monastery of Mary Magdalene, but a monastery in the region, but it was sent to Melitene to be decorated. As for links between the monastery of Mary Magdalene and Melitene, I must confess, I can't think of very direct ones on top of my head because a lot of and I might be really wrong about this, but the connection I can think of to another Syriac center is Edessa. There are loads of, because we know from colophons in these manuscripts that after the fall of Edessa, loads of the Syriac Orthodox community there moves to Jerusalem, and the monastery of Mary Magdalene receives them. This includes scribes. So we do have mentions of scribes from Edessa who moved to Jerusalem and copy manuscripts in Jerusalem in this period. I'll definitely keep an eye out for Melitene. I'm sorry, I can't think of an example on top of my head just at the moment. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Maria, and we look forward to a lot of your future work. Thank you so much for this talk, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for the opportunity.